Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Las Vegas is a very interesting place. There was a cartoon, either by Far Side or Bizarro, one of those, that had this guy driving up in a car, and in the distance were all these skyscrapers, and a big sign over the road says, "Welcome to Las Vegas, brought to you by people who don't understand mathematics." Happily, the attendees at this conference do understand mathematics, and we think we'll take advantage of that in the time this evening. The Science and Environmental Policy Project is very pleased and honored to be able to present the Frederick Seitz Award annually. And by knowing a little more about Frederick Seitz, you'll better understand the significance of this award. Frederick Seitz lived from 1911 to 2008. He was a major contributor to solid-state physics, beginning back with Eugene Wigner in the 30s and 40s, when he constructed a quantum mechanical picture of solids. Remember, those were still the early days of quantum mechanics. During his career, subsequently, Seitz was president of the American Physical Society, president of Rockefeller University, and president of the National Academy of Sciences. It's a very distinguished career. Throughout it all, he held to the tenets of the scientific method, insisting that data is always superior to theory. He embodied this absolute integrity in his own work and instilled it in his students. Years passed, and as the field of climate science, climate change, global warming, etc., developed in the early 1990s, Frederick Seitz was appalled at the deterioration of the peer review system that he was witnessing. For many centuries, peer review had been a cornerstone of science, and here it was going down the drain. In 1996, Seitz wrote a major paper in the Wall Street Journal, major article, in which he denounced the corruption of the peer review system. It was pretty hard-hitting, and we in this community have been the ones who have watched his predictions come true over the past 2 decades. While Seitz lost some friends by taking such a stance, people who prioritize the serene calm of the faculty lounge as without any dissension. But Frederick Seitz correctly perceived that scientific integrity is far more important than faculty friends. Seitz stood by true science, never counting the cost. For the rest of his life, Seitz remained a revered figure in us, but was a pariah to the keepers of the climate orthodoxy. The founder of SEPP, Fred Singer, was a longtime colleague of Seitz's, and if you look at the book that's in your packet of your little bag of registration, Fred Singer's book, Hot Talk and Cold Science, you will see the same thing that Frederick Seitz exhibited shown there: integrity and respect for science. Fred Singer initiated this award during the last decade in order to recognize and honor scientists whose actions emulate this same outlook and practice of Frederick Seitz. So, presenting this year's award will be Ken Haapala, the president of SEPP.
Thank you, Tom. Greetings, carbon-based life forms. When you breathe, you increase the carbon dioxide of the air you use by 100 times. Washington declares that your carbon dioxide is causing a climate crisis. You're still breathing? How dare you! At this conference, we'll see the evidence shows there is no climate crisis. Physical science develops with the constant conflict between ideas and evidence. What ideas best fit the physical science is what's important, the physical evidence. When the physical evidence changes, ideas must change accordingly. Otherwise, the science becomes stagnant, dogmatic. That is what is happening to the science claimed by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its followers, including many once noted US science institutions. In 1988, the UN established the IPCC to assess the scientific information related to changes in climate from emissions of greenhouse gases and to formulate realistic responses. The IPCC issued its first report in 1990. Since then, a great deal has changed, including human conditions have greatly improved thanks to the use of fossil fuels. The physical evidence of what is happening with increasing carbon dioxide has improved. And the attitudes of Western governments to changing science according to the evidence have worsened. Over the last 30 years, one of the most remarkable changes is the tremendous reduction of people living in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty defined as a person having a local purchasing power of less than $2 a day, $1.90. It is estimated in local currency adjusted to inflation and similar issues. Try buying a cup of coffee here for $2 a day. The estimates used here come from Our World in Data. I think this is the right, but there, no, back. There we go. You can see 30 years ago, about 1.9 billion people, 36% of the world's population, lived in extreme poverty, mostly in Asia. Extreme poverty is the edge of death. In 2018, only 650 million people lived on the edge. Far too many, but a remarkable drop. Only about 9% of the world's population. This great reduction in those living in extreme poverty occurred despite an increase in population of about 43%. Fossil fuels have delivered a miracle. From 1990 through 2018, the world's CO2 emissions increased by 60%. China's CO2 emissions grew about 315%, more than three times. As you can see in this chart, today Asia emits more CO2 than all the other continents combined. And yet the Western world is insisting that Asia is causing a climate crisis. A second remarkable change is space-age technology, which gives us the ability to observe and measure what is occurring in the atmosphere. Contrary to the scientific method, this evidence contradicts the earlier scientific speculation that went into the IPCC original report. Despite a 60% increase in carbon dioxide, the influence of CO2 on global temperatures is modest, not dangerous. Presenting this week will be people who will discuss that more fully. A third remarkable change is the obstinance of the Western governments and many in Western science institutions in their ignoring the changing evidence. Contrary to the scientific method, they are refusing to adjust their views, which they still call scientific, and they refuse to recognize the great expansion in physical evidence about the atmosphere and the effects of carbon dioxide. With mounting physical evidence, what began as scientific speculation has drifted into a world of science fiction and political myth. Washington, D.C. is a hotbed for science myths and attacking those who dare question them, as Frederick Seitz was attacked, brutally, smeared. Our honoree this evening has already experienced what happens to physicists who challenge the accepted myths with physical evidence. In his experiments estimating precipitation, he always advocated those measurements must be checked and double-checked. And when the scientific concepts do not meet the evidence from experiments and observations, the concepts must be changed. This winter, when given the opportunity, he bravely stood up and, with the support of a few, declared certain myths popular in Washington are not science, and explained why. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege to present to you the honoree of the 2021 Frederick Seitz Memorial Award, Dr. David Legates. David? Come on up, pal. Congratulations,
Thank you very
David.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What?
Oh, I see. Whoops.
The Frederick Seitz Award. Well earned.
Thank you.
Show it proudly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well deserved, young man.
Well, thank you very much. You know, as somebody once said, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and I feel like right now that if I jumped off, I'd only be 2 feet tall. I'm very honored and privileged to accept this award. There's a number of people I need to thank. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Frederick Seitz, who unfortunately I never met, but I wish I did, and I feel to some extent a kindred spirit with him. In any event, I also want to thank another Fred Singer, who is the creator and founder of SEPP. I did get to meet Fred, I did get to know Fred, and I'm glad to be able to say that Fred was my friend, and that I think he was an excellent person, and I am much better off for knowing and having met him during my career. I also want to thank Ken and Tom and the SEPP and the board for thinking so highly of me to give me this award. I'm very appreciative of them, and I'm glad for the fact that they have not quit and that they've continued forward in fighting the good fight in trying to get science method into further use, particularly in climatology, but in other areas of science as well. I also want to thank the Heartland Institute because, well, we wouldn't be here obviously without them, but I think without Heartland, it would be a lot more difficult to get people together. And I know from various meetings like this and through Heartland, I've met a lot more people than I would have normally. And so Heartland deserves a very big round of credit for putting these things together and keeping them going. I also want to thank three people that I don't think you've ever met: my mother, my father, and my grandmother. They're the three best people I could have ever asked for to help raise me. Like I said, I wish you would meet them, and I wish I could have shared this with them. They're all gone at this point, but they're not gone in spirit. And so I will remember them on and hopefully get to see them again one day. And I also want to thank all of you for staying around. I know that you could have gone off to the crap tables, but instead you've decided to stay here and listen to standard skeptic crap. And I'll explain that term as we come up in a moment. Now at this point, I'm supposed to give a keynote speech, and wow, that's a tall order. I had thought about several things to talk about. I have a bunch of notes, for example, on my PowerPoints. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see them, so we're going through an experiment now where I'm going to demonstrate to you that people from Delaware can actually give a talk without using a teleprompter. And if I'm unsuccessful, they will simply cut the feed and I'll go off to bed. As I said, I was trying to figure out what to talk about, and one of the things I wanted to say is where I thought climate science was and where it was going. But in fact, Dick Lindzen did an excellent job of that at the last Heartland, and I certainly couldn't hold a candle to that presentation. I want to talk about the kind of precipitation, climatology, and science that I'd been working on, but there's too much of an overlap with the excellent presentation that Roy Spencer gave. And I wanted to talk about climate alarmists and some of the weird things they're up to, but Will Happer did an excellent job there too. So unfortunately, everything I want to do is either A, already been done, or B, there's somebody in the room who could simply do it better than I could and knows more about it. So I really wasn't sure where to go. So of course, I turned to the Oracle. And I said, Jim, what should I talk about? And Jim Lakely says to me, here's how you should start your talk. You should say, I was born in a small log cabin in Delaware, and I was a voracious reader. Now, I think he said reader and not eater, but I'll go with reader because it fits something I may say a little bit later on. But in any event, that started to sound more like, this is my life and you don't want to know that much about my life. Believe me, I don't want to live it again. So that was not a good solution. And so I finally turned back to Ken and I said, I really don't know what to do. And he's very graciously said, David, you can talk about anything you'd like to talk about. And so I took the liberty of therefore deciding that today we would talk about space aliens. Except I'm not allowed to call them aliens, that's a pejorative, so they're space beings. Now, the reason I chose to talk about space beings is not because this is Friday night, and if you turn on the History Channel or the Discovery Channel or the Science Channel, you will see stories or programs on UFO files. You'll see programs on ancient aliens. Apparently Friday night is when they all come out. That's not why I want to talk about it, and it's not the reason I don't want to talk about it either is because we can talk about it. One of the interesting things is we can have a discussion of space aliens, or excuse me, space beings. One side of the room could take the thing that they exist. The other side could say they don't. We could have a discussion back and forth, and we could let the facts decide how the results make out. We couldn't do that with climate change. So if I mention climate change at all in this talk, YouTube is going to put a disclaimer down at the bottom because we're just not allowed to have that kind of discussion. No, in fact, the reason I'm not talking about it tonight either is because I'm booked on Southwest Airlines, and if this had been last week, this would probably be the only way I'd have gotten here in time. But nevertheless, no, the real reason I want to talk about space beings tonight is because it's why I'm here. And let me explain why that is. Back when I was in 8th grade, I was taking a course in geology. And we were learning about the geological history of the planet. We were talking about rocks and things like schist and mica and shale and all sorts of other fun stuff like that. And then one day the teacher came in and he said, there is a new book out that's going to change the paradigm of science. This is going to change how we view science going forward in the future and how science is done. We're going to have to change our history. It's going to change the way in which we view anthropology. It's going to change in particular even our own religion. It's that important that we're going to set aside geology to study it. Now, this was one of the quintessential books of our time, of course. It was not an inconvenient truth. That was the quintessential book of the next generation. But for people that are about as old as I am, I think about 35 or so, you will remember this book, and I'm sure. It's by Erich von Däniken, and it's called Chariots of the Gods. And to an 8th grader, Chariots of the Gods makes an awful lot of sense. Erich von Däniken has done an excellent job of taking a bunch of pieces to a puzzle and putting them all together. And what you learn from reading that book is that, in fact, life originated on Earth from beings in the Pleiades, who came here with something they had developed called DNA, and using it, they had developed a variety of different flora and fauna. They populated the planet. They built all sorts of fun things like Stonehenge and pyramids and the Sphinx, and they taught us math and physics and science and how to run a civilization, and then sprung up civilization in a number of different places. And then they left, and they either went back to the Pleiades, or they went and hid around the corner somewhere and been watching us all along. We're not sure, but at some point they will be back in the future. We're positive of that. And as I said, to an 8th grader, this discussion makes all the sort of sense. And that caused me to raise a bunch of other questions. And so I started becoming a voracious reader and started looking into all of these types of things and determining why von Däniken had come up with these answers and so forth. And I came eventually, about 2 weeks later, I was in a store, and there was I almost said a rick, but you wouldn't have any idea what a rick is. It's essentially a carousel that contains a bunch of books. And I came up on another book. And that book is by Clifford Wilson, and is titled Crash Go the Chariots. And now if you read that book, you realize that Erich von Däniken may not have gotten it just right. That his intricately woven tapestry may have some holes. Some of the pieces of the puzzle may actually not be there. They may actually have been fraudulent, or they may have been made up. He may have, in fact, in some cases, they fit better the old way than the new way. And essentially what you'll wind up with is two different viewpoints of the same thing. And so that allowed me to understand the concept of scientific debate and scientific discourse. The idea is that you could look at one argument on this side, and you could look at another argument on the other side, And then we could evaluate the two. And one of the things I definitely miss from Fred Singer is every time he'd send out an email, there was a line at the bottom of the email, a quote that said, "If the facts change, I change my view. What do you do, sir?" And the idea is that in this case, the facts drive everything. So in the scientific method, we examine the two views, and maybe you think von Daniken is correct, or maybe you think Wilson is correct, or maybe you think none of them is correct. There's a third alternative. But at the very least, that is what the scientific method was all about, is looking at how one topic could be evaluated in a variety of different ways and using the facts to make that decision. Well, I was pleased because I'd learned something, and I'm in 8th grade, and you don't usually learn lots of stuff. So I went to the professor, it's 8th grade. I went to the teacher, and I gave him the book, and he read it over the weekend, and he came back the next morning, Monday morning, and I remember he dropped it on my desk in front of me, and he said the 3 words that I would hear several times over my career: standard, skeptic, crap. Now, the reason I love those 3 words, and I wear them like a badge on my sleeve, is because I am probably the only person in the world whose research has been characterized by the word crap in the prestigious journal Science. Believe me, you've arrived when your research is called crap at that level. In any event, I learned something else that day. I learned that there is science discourse and science, the scientific method, and on the other hand, there is indoctrination. One side fits all, everybody must agree, nobody can disagree, we're not allowed to listen to the other side of the spectrum. And of course, I learned later about the history of Trofim Lysenko and the Soviet Union, and how the Soviet Union was set back many decades in agriculture simply because they wouldn't investigate Mendel's peas and the idea of genetics. But the idea was that, again, I learned that day, and it raised a lot more questions, is we've got to be able to discuss both sides of the issue. So when I finally left my quest for investigating ancient beings and moved into climatology, I carried that with me. And so as a result, I want to look at why things happen. I want to understand them, and based on the facts. And as Fred always indicated to us through the quote, if the facts change, I change my view. What do you do? And so that's the scientific method. That's what we should be striving for. And I don't care what the answer is at the end, as long as the answer is a logically determined effort from science and not from indoctrination. Oops. Oh, okay. Sorry, the problem is I can't see my notes. So now one of the things I recognized was that in the discussion of ancient or of beings from space is that one thing you could always count on, and that was that the federal government was always going to tell you, nothing to see here, please move along. It was a weather satellite, it was swamp gas, it was ball lightning. I don't know why it was always the atmospheric science people that were to blame, but in any event, maybe that's why I got into climatology. But in any event, that was the argument. But then about a year ago, less than a year ago, we start to see articles like this coming out. U.S. government prepares to issue landmark report on UFOs. And now they're telling us, well, we're not sure. It's not ours. We don't think it's friendly. We don't think it's Russian. We don't think it's Chinese. We're not sure what's happened. We've got tic-tacs moving 200 mile an hour. We've got rubber duckies moving at 200 mile an hour. Believe me, with my Remington 870 and a load of buckshot, I can make a rubber ducky move at 200 mile an hour. But nevertheless, that raises a whole lot more questions. Why? Why now? What has changed? What facts are different? Were you lying to us then, or are you lying to us now? In other words, every fact or everything we find should raise a number more questions. The problem now is I have also mentioned the federal government. And several days ago, I went to our website for this thing, and I noticed, oh my goodness, they've already picked a topic for me. And the topic is, if I can read it, the perils of being a climate realist in government. Now, there are several people in the room who've been in government a whole lot longer than I have. But I, unfortunately, you may or may not know, worked with the Trump administration and spent 4 long, arduous months in Washington, D.C. And yes, that's the problem. 3.5 years into the administration, we were changing essentially career personnel and taking them out of where they were, which was in what was supposed to be political positions. So yes, why this waited till the end, I don't know. But any event, my sojourn at the federal government went okay. There's some things I can't talk about, and I can't talk about in detail, and you'll see why in a moment. But any event, there's some things I have gleaned about the government that I'll provide you. This is where I worked. I didn't say this is where my office was, because I didn't have an office. But this is where I worked at the Herbert Hoover building in downtown DC. It is where the Department of Commerce is located. I worked there for 7 weeks. It took me 3 weeks to get my federal government email account. It took me 4 weeks to get a government computer, a government cell phone, and a government-issued ID card. That should also tell you the relationship between people at DC. If somebody working there doesn't get a government-issued ID card for 4 weeks, the question is, how on earth did I get in the building? And the answer is, people let me in, which is a violation of all sorts of security rules, but nevertheless, I didn't say that. Sorry. So 7 weeks I worked there. I'm not sure exactly that I was there. I have little proof. There was no public release, press release. There was no website that gave me my position. There was, I do have pay stubs, so I can verify that. But the only thing I was able to find was a NOAA's headquarter organization chart, which puts my name right below Admiral Gallaudet, who was second in command. So technically speaking, if for some reason Neil Jacobs and Admiral Gallaudet were knocked out, then it looks like Eugenio and I would be in charge of NOAA. I don't think that's the case, but that's the way the chart makes it look. And again, the weird thing about it, after having been there for 7 weeks, is I did absolutely nothing, which fits in perfectly with the federal government. But in fact, the NOAA Chief of Staff went to the White House and said, "What's Legates doing over here? We have nothing for him to do." They said, "Well, he's supposed to be here to help working on the National Climate Assessment. We've just hired Betsy Weatherhead. She's a career. She's going to be pushing forward the National Climate Assessment. We want him to work on the political side to help push it forward." And as the Chief of Staff said, "You do know NOAA has no power in that. If you want to give him any power, he should have been put in the White House." So the White House didn't know that I should have been in the White House to do this work. So after 7 weeks, I was detailed from NOAA to the White House. Now that is not the White House, but that is the building, again, in which I worked. I did not have an office. I never had an office in DC, by the way, but that's fine. This is the Eisenhower building, the executive office building where I spent time. Not criminal time, but spent time. And in particular, I was then put in charge of the U.S. Global Change Research Program as its executive director. It's where essentially I did nothing because the deep staters kept me from everything. They would issue tweets and never tell me about them and so forth. And at that point, I realized I only have 9 weeks left. So I'm here to work on the National Climate Assessment. That's what I'm going to focus on. So that's what I did. Well, I didn't realize I had 9 weeks left, but that's not really how much time I had left. For you see, one of those weeks was Thanksgiving. One was Christmas. One was New Year's. One was the American Meteorological Society meeting, which shut everything down. And one was the last week where I was sent back to NOAA, and detail ended. I was not fired, but I was sent back to NOAA. So of those 9 weeks, 5 I could do nothing, and so I could only spend time on 4 weeks working on the National Climate Assessment. Working on the National Climate Assessment for those 4 weeks was interesting because 2 things happened. One, I found that we were playing a bizarre game of 3-dimensional chess, whereas the party line to the media was that the Trump administration is delaying the game, trying to keep the National Climate Assessment from going forward, so what we're going to have to do is therefore just have 2 people write the entire science document. On the other hand, what was really happening behind the scenes is Betsy, and with my help, we were trying to push this forward, get a number of writers on board, and we were being stopped by the deep state people who wanted to be able to say that it was the Trump administration's fault as to why nothing was getting done. The second thing is that in only 4 weeks, I managed to get myself charged with 3 criminal charges. Now, the reason I was charged with criminal charges is largely because I had 3 strikes against me. 1, I'm a climate denier. 2, I work for the Trump administration. And 3, I filed a whistleblower complaint. That's all it took. But, which is why I really can't say lots about it, but there are 3 things that I have gleaned from the federal government. And when I say federal government, I'm talking about the hierarchy that exists in and around 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The first thing is that essentially your title is the length of your title is inversely proportional to the amount of power you actually have. So the president is one word, has lots of power, except possibly for this current president. But in any event, my title officially at the end was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction on detail to the White House as the Executive Director of the United States Global Change Research Program. That is 28 words, therefore I had virtually no power at all. I think that in particular, the janitor had a shorter title, and yes, she had even more power than I did. The second thing I noted is a lot of people refer to DC as the swamp. And that's okay if you're referring to the ecological association with the Potomac River Basin, if you're talking about Northern Virginia and Maryland and the ecological conditions of that region, then as a physical geography standpoint, swamp makes sense. Because the definition of a swamp is a wetland ecosystem characterized by mineral soils, poor drainage, forested vegetation, and a large variety of plant and animal life. So there's lots of life and they're living well. And in particular, a swamp is a very viable and necessary ecosystem. And in some cases, it looks beautiful. None of these are true of the federal government hierarchy inside DC. If you must use a euphemism, then let me suggest the following. Cesspool. A cesspool is defined as a covered hole or pit that is used to collect and store human refuse. And I think there's quite a bit of human refuse there, but the one I like better is the Merriam-Webster definition, which is a filthy, disgusting, or morally corrupt place, and I added the Washington, D.C. The third thing I noticed, and I got this actually partially from, I don't know where he is, but Will Happer told me the story how when he was involved with the Department of Energy back in the Bush administration that he had a secretary named Joyce, and she said there are 2 types of people here in DC. Well, I think Joyce is wrong. She may have been right at the time, but maybe there's a third type that has arisen. But in any event, I'll use her terminology and expand on it. She said there's three types of people. The first type of person are the weebies. Weebies are we be here when the administration leaves. These are the deep state people, the career politicians, or the career people, I should say. Weebies are, there's some nice ones, I will admit, but by and large, they should all be sent to the 10th level of Dantes Hell. Dante, I know, didn't have 10 levels. That's because he didn't know about the U.S. federal government. The second type of people are the UBs. You be leaving when the administration ends. These are the political appointees. What I found is that the weebies and the UBs tend to fight back and forth, sort of like Laurel and Hardy. And they beat each other, although it's non-comical. I am simply amazed at some of the things I have seen go on between, as I said, the career people and the political people, and maybe it's not as bad in this administration, but it was pretty bad in the last administration. As I said, there's a third group of people that I found. They I call the we wannabes. These are the people who are actually political appointees but want to be able to appease the weebies and maybe join them at some point. They are going to be confined to Dante's 11th level of hell because I think they're even farther down than the weebies. So the question, I always have lots of questions. I don't know, this comes back again to my discussion of beings from outer space, but the fundamental question is, was it all worth it? Taking 4 months off to go to DC. It wasn't bad in terms of a commute from my doorstep in Middletown, Delaware, to parking garage, to walking into one of these two buildings would take me 2 hours at rush hour. You can't do that pre-COVID. But under COVID, there was nobody around, so if I wanted to go to DC, I could go there in a moment's, well, in a 2-hour notice. So that was useful for me, whereas if you were, you know, in Washington, if you were in Washington State, or if you were in California, you'd have to move to DC, and then the answer may have been no. But for me, I find the answer was indeed yes. Why? More questions. Because, one, I had to see it for myself. There is something to say about understanding what's going on, and you can learn by watching it happen, but you have to experience it firsthand to really get the appreciation or lack of appreciation as to exactly what things are. But the most important reason was, and I should say, I have no interest in ever going back. I don't care what happens, I don't want to ever venture inside the Beltway, not even to see the Nats play or anything like that. Nope, I'm done with DC. But the other reason is the answer to the question, what would I have been doing if I hadn't have gone to DC? And the answer is, I would have been back at a woke university teaching online using Zoom to a bunch of students that were taking advantage of the system, that were cheating like mad, and when you found them cheating, the university turned a blind eye towards it, and if they didn't like the grade they received, the university would allow them to change it. That is not the way a university should operate. Now, I know this is also Joe Biden University. Joe Biden is not a member of, not a faculty at the University of Delaware. He has a Biden Center. He is faculty of the University of Pennsylvania. Why? Because he always said, I'm from Scranton, I'm from Scranton, I'm from Scranton, and that's why we always used to say he is Pennsylvania's third senator. But the reason is that Joe is that he knew that if he ever decided to run for president, he would need votes from Pennsylvania. And fortunately, he's so old, that'll never happen again. No, but I do need to defend Joe particularly. Being a Delaware native, I understand, and Joe has taken some flack for his comments on corn pop. Again, I'm a Delaware native from Delaware, and I'm not as old as Joe, so I don't know Corn Pop, but I do know his two younger brothers, Sugar and Coco. And I do know they were bad people. If you hung around them for too long, there was certainly a guarantee you were going to get diabetes. The Pop brothers were definitely bad dudes, so I can agree with Joe on that one. So at that point, I think I'm about out of time. I'm looking for the timer, but I don't have one. And I was trying to figure out, how do I put all this back together? Now that I've unraveled so much stuff, you always like the last slide to tie everything up in a nice bow so everybody can go home pleased, or at least just go home. And so I looked around, and surprisingly, I found a quote. And this quote is by Dr. Fred Seitz. And the quote says, "A good scientist is a person in whom the childhood quality of perennial curiosity lingers on. Once he gets an answer, he has more questions." The curiosity of trying to come up with the answer to science means that we have to follow the scientific method. We have to investigate all avenues, and we have to do it using essentially the facts as our driving force. As Fred Singer used to show us, if the facts change, I change my views. But in particular, we use the scientific method. We can't rely on indoctrination and Lysenkoism. We have to fight against that. And in particular, we always recognize it's going to always cause us to ask a lot more questions. I thank you very much. Again, it's an honor and a privilege to win this award named after Dr. Frederick Seitz. And I thank you all for being here, and have a good evening.